Okay, welcome back. This is part 3 of our lecture on representation. And when we last left off, I was um, talking about the Venus of Willendorf and just talking about how what we think of as when we think something is real or realistic is maybe a little bit short-sighted, a little bit only part of the truth. So here's another example of what I'm trying to get at, which is here are 3 images and they are all unreal in various ways. Okay, and in part they are all unreal in part because they are all using photography. So the Cindy Sherman piece is an actual photograph, but it's unreal in part because it's a setup. She's creating a scene where she's kind of playing a character, she's playing a role, she's purposely wearing clothes that are out of date so that she's creating kind of a scene as if she was in an older movie. This was shot in 1978, but it looks like it's early 60s, right, from her hairstyle and the clothes that she's wearing. This was all part of this series where she was just going around the city creating these kind of scenes as if they were scenes from movies, but movies of no particular, movie, right? Scenes from no particular movies. The Gerhard Richter painting is unreal because it is not a painting of Betty, right? It's not a painting of a person. It is a very exacting painting of a photograph. And that including, you know, being as faithful to all the ambiguities and all the blurring and all the confusion in the photograph and not being faithful to Betty herself, right, is part of the point of the painting. And the Vermeer is also unreal, in part because it's very stylized and it's very kind of geometric, but it's also unreal because Vermeer also used a camera, not a photographic camera, not like a camera with film, but he used a camera obscura, a mechanical means of projecting an image on a wall or on a canvas to then use as a starting point for his drawing and for his painting. And so he's creating a certain unreality too, right? They're all illusions. They're all fake. So what is truthful? And when something is truthful, it's truthful to what part, to what thing, right? Like in both of these cases, in Ai Weiwei's case, the piece, right? These sunflower seeds are meant to look exactly like real sunflower seeds, but they're made out of porcelain, right? They're made out of ceramics. They're hand painted. Each individual one is a hand painted work of ceramics, and that's a room filled 2 or 3 feet tall with those hand painted ceramic works, right? Whereas Jeff Koons also is meant to look exactly like a thing, but it being not being that thing is part of the point, right? If it was an exact replica of an inflatable bunny, it would be an inflatable bunny. It being a representation in another material immediately changes it. So another point I want to make is that, like, sometimes we think that the purpose of representation is to be as naturalistic or to be as realistic as possible, but I would actually argue it's the other way around. It's the deviations from what of being faithful to how we see things, oftentimes, that are the things that make works interesting. Each of these are an example of artists taking liberties with their perception, taking liberties with the way things are visually organized, right? Like this gesture right there, or so much about Giacometti, right, which is about exactingly paying attention to the thing, to the sitter, but not exactingly paying attention to the way things look, right? He's after something more real. Or even the stylization here, right? They seem very realistic because they are from a photograph, but they are not actually a photograph. They are screen prints based off a photograph, and the photograph itself was already a stylization, a breakdown of reality, and then the screen printing process itself simplifies that some more. So what is good representation? What is real representation? These things, these questions should not be as simple as we first thought they were going to be, right? And so is this unrealistic? Is this a crude representation? Well, if you know the career of Philip Guston and you know all the different kinds of paintings that he could make and did make, then you start to wonder, well, maybe this is a type of crudeness for a point. And if it's for a point, then maybe it's not really crude at all. And if it's controlled, maybe not. So here's some final points I want to make about getting back to the classical period and getting back to the Parthenon about representation. And that is, number one, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story. So after the Parthenon was erected, right, and there's a lot of controversy with Pericles and the project of the Parthenon, the project of all of the different architectural buildings in the Acropolis, right, and the amount of money that Athens spent, and the amount of that money that came from other Greek cities. So there was a lot of resentment and controversy surrounding that. And immediately after the construction of the Parthenon, there was a scandal, which was there was a belief that on one of the friezes on the inside wall, right, of the colonnade in the Parthenon, there was a representation of a person in the procession that was a very close, exact representation of Phidias. Phidias was the sculptor who was the head architect and head sculptor of the project. And maybe also a representation of Pericles, but definitely a representation of Phidias. And Phidias was actually taken to trial for this. This was considered heresy, to put your own representation on a temple. Okay, so I want you to think about that for a second. And then think about the difference between that versus someone like Raphael putting his portrait right there in this group of great great Greek philosophers, right? And there's Raphael. This is a painting in the Vatican, right? He had no problem putting his, or not no problem, but it was definitely not the same kind of heretical action as it was in the day of Phidias. Caravaggio put his portrait here, right? Here's a painting of David and Goliath, and Caravaggio made himself the beheaded head of Goliath. Makes you wonder what he was thinking about himself. So in the ancient world, there was much more ambivalence about portraiture, right? And I want you to think about, like, portraiture in some ways is the most extreme form of naturalistic representation, if it actually looks like the actual person, right? There was a lot of ambivalence about portraiture. One of the things that you may or may not know about the bust of Queen Nefertiti, I'm not sure if I covered it in the lecture. This is not meant to be a work of art, right? It's not meant to be a public work of art, at least, right? It was instead like a snapshot. It was a sketch that the artists who worked in the studio that made the public sculptures for Akhenaten and Nefertiti, it was a model that they made so they had something to copy. It was not intended to be ever on display. It was intended to live in the sculpture studio so that when they wanted to make, a public portrait, they had an image of Nefertiti to look at. So, but it was meant to be more realistic, more accurate to Nefertiti than any of the sculptures that they made. The actual sculptures that they were going to make of her were going to be more stylized, more reduced so that they could look more, not just like Nefertiti, but like every queen of every pharaoh, right? So here the Egyptians show a certain ambivalence, right? A certain interest in naturalism and accuracy, in that they made this model and it looks like it might be quite accurate to her, although it is also quite stylized. But then the public works that they made from her were much more stylized beyond that. That's my 1 minute warning. So I think I'll be able to finish. So one last thing, or two last things maybe. So what I want to say about Roman portraiture, at the start of Rome, I'm going to skip the Rome and we'll talk about that at another point. So I just want to say that when we look at Western art and when we get to the Renaissance and artwork from the Renaissance into the Baroque, and we start seeing self-portraits like this, right? We should consider the fact that it is more of an aberration overall in the history of art rather than an obvious thing that could have occurred, right? Artists getting comfortable with really looking at themselves directly in the face and trying to represent them exactly the way they